Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 4. And this week, I want to take a little bit of a diversion. It's a diversion. It's obviously a week of your class time. It's a diversion into considering policy from a narrative standpoint. So you see the title of this lecture is Reading Policy Analysis as Narratives. This lecture should be relatively short, and you notice on Canvas and in the syllabus, I really don't assign any readings except for you to look at Social Security through the lenses of various policy analyses. And so what you ought to notice right away as you consider those readings is that the various policy analyses come at Social Security from different directions. From the standpoint of a government policy analysis, which is nonpartisan, and that is the Congressional Budget Office. And then I ask you to consider the analysis of several think tanks. And these think tanks approach Social Security from different partisan lenses, if you will. So the intent really of the week is to have you look at these various analyses and consider how perspectives might change given the narrative about a particular policy. And as you know, I like to use Social Security really as an example in this class because it is such a wide-ranging area and there is divergence of view across many different advocates of Social Security. So let me move right into that, and I think you'll see what we're talking about here. So I kind of talked about this in the intro slide. The readings I assigned you this week look at Social Security, but they do it with different lenses. And so that's the first thing you ought to notice. And so what these different lenses do for us in terms of what we've been talking about in the Kraft text and in the Bardak text is that they really actually end up potentially defining the problem differently. And so in this case, if we say there are policy problems associated with the policy of Social Security, then what is that problem? And so I think you'll see that these different perspectives will potentially give you a different problem statement. So there's a lot of ways we can analyze policy, right? And we've talked about this. We've talked about analyzing policy from an economic standpoint. We could also analyze policy from the standpoint of equity. We can analyze policy from the standpoint of political expediency. We can analyze policy from the standpoint of administrative feasibility. That is, will this policy actually work out for the people who have to administer the program? Narrative policy analysis is yet just another way of analyzing policy. And so narratives really are just the stories that people tell. And so, what we ought to think about is that we do tell stories. Really, as human beings and as policymakers, we tell stories about things, and policy is one of the things we tell story about. So I would ask that don't be confused between thinking of policy as a narrative and then taking a more interpretive approach to policy. And so I'd point to Devar Yano, who wrote a famous book called How Does a Policy Mean way back in 1997, so 22 years ago, and Ingram and Schneider, who first wrote in 1993 with a lot of follow-up research on social construction of target populations. So both what Voriano was doing and what Ingram and Schneider were doing was they were interpreting the policy itself and interpreting what that policy meant, basically from the standpoint of government, of organizations, and of the social construction of the clients who really were the recipients of that policy. What this is about is telling a story about policy and how it actually came to be and what it's going to do in the future. So one of the really early theorists in a book that's really interesting is 2002, Deborah Stone wrote a book called Policy Paradox. And so a lot of this presentation relies on her work. It's a pretty easy read of a book, and for some more detailed understanding of this, I'd refer you to her book. So what Stone is saying, particularly in chapter 6 of this book, is that we can tell a story about policy. And so if you think in terms of literature, stories you've read, fiction you've read, stories have a discernible plot, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end, which is obvious. I mean, stories typically have familiar plot sequences, like heroes, villains, and victims. Stories often have a conflict within them, right, over these narrative elements. And so we can tell different kinds of stories, and Deborah Stone talks about some of these in her book. We can talk about a story of decline, and that has some variations, like stymied progress and change is only an illusion. So a story of decline basically says that something started out well, ran into some roadblocks, declined, and now can only be rescued by some hero. Or we could have a story of helplessness and control. So often we see that policy is framed in this way of helplessness, that there may be some kind of conspiracy that prevents the policy from actually taking effect. Or another variation of that is blame the victim. This policy would work if only people would not defraud the program, for example. And so we're looking for people who actively conspire to make the policy a failure. And that's another story that we tell. And so a story of decline is a really familiar one, and I'm going to give an example of that. But so this is a quote from Stone. "In the beginning, things were good, but they got worse. In fact, right now, they are nearly intolerable, and something must be done." So how this storyline goes is the storyteller recites how things have gotten worse, and then in that is either an explicit or an implicit suggestion that sometime in the past things were a lot better, right? The reason why things got worse might not actually be a human. It might be a group of humans, or it might be environmental factors like the economy, for example. So we could say, well, this program was proceeding nicely, but then the economy took a downturn, and it made it impossible to actually implement the program. And so usually at the end of this story, or in the middle of the story, there's a prediction of gloom, unless things change for the better. And so they're probably going to recommend something better, right, to meet that. And then another sort of narrative element is that there's this drama of heroes, villains, and victims, and they're all in the story. So a variation of this is this idea that change is an illusion. So you thought things were getting better, but really they're not. So for example, we do this a lot when we track things like cancer survival rates, right? We can say, well, cancer survival rates really, they're not improving. It's just that early detection has improved. And so we actually have a better handle on tracking. And so the change is only an illusion idea does go along with the idea that we can have better data and say, well, we thought things were getting better, but the data tell us that things aren't getting better. And then there's the stymied progress variation, that we really were making progress, and then we were thwarted by some villain, if you will. For example, we thought we were making progress in anti-terrorism, but then we made a bad agreement with Iran, and we empowered Iran. Of course, that is one familiar story that's being told right now, but the counter to that is we weren't making progress with Iran, and so we made a deal with Iran that actually could constrain them more. So with reference to the United States and its relationship to Iran, we can actually hear a couple of narratives being told right now. And if you listen carefully, you can pick out who the heroes, who the villains, and who the victims are in at least those two separate tellings of that narrative. So the heroes, victims, and villains, they vary by who's telling the story. And so I want to give you an example, and this is from my research. In my dissertation research, I actually researched over a 35-year period um, the, the history of the military retirement system, which is a system that's been around since about 1860, and there have been a lot of policy changes since 1860. But primarily what I researched was post-World War II, and in particular a 35-year period between 1965 and 2000. So this is a story of decline, generally. So post-World War II retirement policy allowed basically a 20-year retirement for people who got a defined benefit type pension, uh, really for life. But here's where the decline happened. It grew more costly as this population of retirees grew. And so, and also as military pay grew generally over time. And so what we see here is, this is going to be familiar with Social Security. We have a larger population of clientele, and that population is growing, and so naturally that's going to increase the cost. So Congress attempted policy changes that would have raised the minimum number years of service from 20 to about 30, but they haven't really been successful at that. So from 1948 to about 1983, there were 19 or 20 official studies that were commissioned either by the Congress or the executive that suggested some kind of change to the military's defined benefit pension, right? And that would have involved changing the formula or changing the years of service or changing the percentage of final pay. And so around this whole argument, a couple of two distinct policy narrative coalitions, I call them, arose. So one I call reformers. And so these were people who told this story of decline, and they wanted changes to the retirement program in the interest of cost savings. So their narrative was that, this is a story of decline, but we can rescue it with measures in law that result in cost changing. So doing things like changing the formula, doing things like cutting back on the cost of living adjustments would rescue the program. And then there was a group I called traditionalists. And so these were people who had been in the military primarily, and they're advocates who wanted no changes in the program because what they argued was that it was an indispensable element of both recruiting and retention for the military. So without this kind of pay and benefit, what would happen was that the United States would be unable to recruit people into the military, and then you would have a failure of a different kind, and that failure would be you would have a gutted military. And what would that do, especially post 1970s when we started the all-volunteer force? What that would do was it would necessitate conscription again, which nobody in Congress wanted. So that was their narrative. And so I drew this little chart to show you the differences in these narrative elements of heroes, villains, victims, and the story of decline. So you see on this chart, I have the reformers and I have the traditionalists. And so they vary in their storytelling about the same policy, about who the heroes are, who the villains are, who the victims are. So the reformers, in their telling of the story, the heroes are people we could call budget hawks in Congress. And really, if you go back to the era of the 1980s, there are a lot of budget hawks in Congress, not just about this, but about everything. Democrats and Republicans. We saw really a lot of bipartisanship in terms of people wanting to balance the budget. So these people were the heroes because they were looking for ways, tools within the budget to balance it. On the other side, the traditionalists said that the real heroes in this story are military members, especially career enlisted members, who really spend their life in dedicated public service and sacrifice for the defense of the country. And then we move on to villains. The reformers actually, in a sense, thought military people were villains, but what if you get into their testimony in congressional hearings and the things they say in newspapers, which is what I looked at, they said especially high-ranking officers, lieutenant colonels and above in the military, were really some of the villains because they were taking advantage of a system that they knew would benefit them. They would be able to retire after 20 or 25 years and then get another job in the government, a lot of them, and draw another pension. The traditionalists actually, almost without hesitation, usually point to Congress as the villains in all of this. That Congress was wanting to balance the budget on the backs of military members. That's a quote. And that's a variation of a quote you saw often in this storytelling. So who are the victims? Well, the reformers, or the budget hawks, if you will, the cost cutters, really said the taxpayers were the victims. So the taxpayers foot the bill for all of this. So they are really being victimized. The traditionalists said, really the victims are the military and their families, military families. So not only do these people military people live a life of dedicated public service, but so do their families. And so when Congress attempts to change pay and benefits, really their families are victimized. And so using families as a set of victims is actually very effective. And I would also say using taxpayers as a victim is very effective. So you could see where the narrative elements actually have some effectiveness and really have some emotional tug on people. So what is the story of decline? The story of decline from the reformer standpoint is that at one time in the storied past, the United States had a balanced budget. Actually, that's not entirely true, but that's the story they told. At one time, the United States had this balanced budget, right? However, generous government benefits, not just the military, but civil service pay, and to some extent Social Security, are overly generous, especially with cost of living adjustments that make a balanced budget virtually impossible. And so the good thing, a balanced budget, is in decline. And this story was told a lot in the 1970s and 1980s. The traditionalists told a story that said that at one time in our storied past, Congress rewarded these brave individuals who spent their life in arduous service to the nation, but Congress and a group of civilian experts with no idea of the sacrifice that's being made want to take benefits away. So again, this will result in this massive loss of retention of mid-grade people in the military, and it will result in the inability to recruit people in the military. And so we lead to demoralization, and we lead to the idea that we have to introduce conscription again. And so in both cases, the story of decline really points you to saying, well, okay, I guess I have to go along with your policy prescription, whatever that might be. So that's my example. But here in Stone's book in chapter 6, she gives these four kind of symbolic devices that are used in these policy narratives. And I want to talk about these because I'm going to have you, for the discussion, think about these elements when you look at Social Security. So there's stories, and we kind of talked, what a story is. So I talked that out, but you can look at the slide. There's this synecdoche. I always say that word wrong. It's not synodoche, it's synecdoche, which is taking a small part of a policy problem and it's used to represent the whole. And that is called a horror story. And one of the horror stories that is often told about policy in Social Security doesn't have to do with the old age disability insurance, which is what we think of with Social Security. It has to do with Social Security disability insurance. So think about this. There has been a lot written, and there have been a lot of documentaries on Social Security disability insurance, SSDI, fraud. And so we're taking examples of SSDI fraud and we're translating that to all of Social Security, or that is done, right? So that's an example of that. And then there's a metaphor, right? So we use metaphors to describe things all the time, right? And so these metaphors might include organisms, natural laws, machines, tools, containers, disease, and war. So we talk about a war on poverty, for example, or we talk about a war on drugs. And so we use the war metaphor a lot in creating policy. And so what does that metaphor carry with it? What that metaphor carries with it is this idea of maximum benefit. So, or not maximum benefit, but maximum effort. So, we're going to launch a war on opioid addiction. We're going to launch a war on poverty. So that means that implies that the maximum effort of the federal government is directed at that. And it's probably an overused metaphor, right? When you really start thinking about the effort that is applied. And then there's ambiguity. So ambiguity really just means the stories you tell has more than one meaning. So what does that allow us, the storyteller, to do? It allows the storyteller really to say, when sort of pinned down for an answer, well, I didn't really say that. I said this other thing, even though it sounded like I said what you said I said. So ambiguity is a common part of this narrative storytelling. So really, and this is actually the end of the lecture, so I told you it was going to be short, and it is. This is really what I want you to talk about this week. So all those views of Social Security I'm having you read, or assigned for this week, what I'd like you to do is look at these, and after reading all these reports, I'd like you to discuss the narrative elements that these various partisan or nonpartisan analysts are using, and examine whether this variety of perspectives broadens your own view on the subject or simply affirms views you already have, or how does the storytelling affect you. And so what I'm asking you to do is kind of get inside these various looks at Social Security and find the story. What kind of story are they telling, and why would they be telling that story? That's really the thrust of this discussion this week. So here again are my references, and please do let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.